I'm not going to pretend there's an obvious answer here. I've done the research, looked at the economic data, the legal frameworks, the humanitarian costs, the security arguments, and what I found is that this question lands people who are actually thoughtful in genuinely different places, and that's worth explaining. Because the cable news version of this debate is mostly straw men fighting each other. So let me start with what the evidence clearly shows, then work through where reasonable disagreement becomes unavoidable. This one I'll lead with because it's where the evidence is cleanest, and it contradicts what a lot of people assume. Undocumented immigrants commit crimes at lower rates than US born citizens. The data is consistent across multiple methodologies. They're arrested at less than half the rate of native born citizens for violent crimes, homicide, assault, and RAPE, and about 25% the rate for property crimes. For drug offenses, undocumented immigrants have arrest rates of 135 per 100,000 versus 337 per 100,000 for US born citizens. This pattern holds in both official police reports and victimization surveys, which means it's not just about willingness to report to police, nor is it a recent phenomenon. A longitudinal study spanning 1990 to 2014 found that increased unauthorized immigration was associated with decreasing violent crime, not increasing it. So if you're arguing we need mass deportation primarily for public safety, the empirical foundation for that is weak. That doesn't mean safety is never a legitimate consideration for individual cases, obviously, but it does mean the general narrative that undocumented immigrants are a crime wave is factually wrong. Here's where it gets actually complicated, and where smart people start to disagree. The consensus view says mass deportation would harm the economy. Removing 8 million undocumented workers would reduce GDP by 2.6 to 6.2% over a decade, depending on the model. That translates to somewhere between $5 to $15 trillion in economic losses. Federal tax revenue would drop by roughly 190 to 300 billion over 10 years, and the enforcement costs are brutal. ICE's detention budget alone hit $14 billion in fiscal 2025, a 400% increase from 2024, with another 11.25 billion committed annually through 2029. The total cost to actually deport 8 million people, roughly $1.6 to $1.7 trillion over a decade. Why would the economy shrink that much? Because undocumented workers aren't just a burden on services, they're actually producing economic value. They work in agriculture, construction, hospitality, childcare, and other labor-intensive sectors. When you remove them, you don't just lose their tax contributions, you lose the jobs they support, the consumption they generate, the businesses that depend on their labor. Prices in construction, food, and childcare would spike, estimated at 9.1% inflation across the economy by 2028. That hurts everyone, but especially low-income Americans. But the other side has a real point too. Yes, economic growth shrinks, but the question some economists ask, if shrinks compared to what? If you accept lower growth, but achieve something you consider more important, like wage growth for specific groups of US workers, maybe there's a reasonable trade-off. And here's where they have the data. Undocumented immigrants do suppress wages in low-skilled labor markets, not catastrophically, but measurably. When immigrant composition increases by 1% in a low-skilled occupation, wages drop by roughly 0.8% for native workers in that field. For someone without a high school degree, this could mean $1,900 a year lost in wages. During Trump's first term, when illegal immigration declined, low-skilled US workers without a bachelor's degree saw a 3.2% real wage increase. Is that casual proof that deportation raises wages? Not necessarily. Lots of other factors affect wages, but it at least shows the theoretical relationship isn't imaginary. The actual disagreement, pro-deportation economists, mostly at Heritage Foundation, say targeted enforcement reducing undocumented immigration could raise wages for low-skilled Americans. Anti-deportation economists point out that A, historical mass deportations haven't actually created jobs for native workers. Removing workers just shifts things. It doesn't create new jobs. And B, the economic disruption cost is so massive it swamps any wage gains. Even if low-skilled workers see a temporary bump, the overall damage to the economy and to different groups of workers is worse. So, who's right? Well, both have evidence. The disagreement is partly about which effects matter more to you, and partly about empirical questions that the data hasn't fully settled. That's honest academic disagreement and not something to do with bad faith. Okay, when talking about fiscal burden versus contribution, it starts to get emotionally charged, but the numbers tell a surprising story. Heritage Foundation analysis argues undocumented immigrants run a net fiscal deficit. They receive roughly $24,721 in government benefits annually per household while paying only $10,000 and $344 in taxes, creating a $14,387 annual deficit per household, scaled across millions of households. That's tens of billions of dollars in annual costs. The counter argument is, yes, undocumented immigrants use more in benefits than they pay in certain years, but this is partly because they're excluded from higher wage jobs and employer-sponsored benefits. Plus, many of the benefits they use, like emergency room visits or education, are investments that create value. And when you look at lifetime fiscal impact, not just current year, immigrants contribute significantly more than they consume. One analysis found immigrants contribute $237,000 more in lifetime taxes than they receive in benefits. Also, undocumented immigrants pay $96.7 billion in taxes annually, federal, state, and local combined. Though over a third of that, $33.9 billion, goes to Social Security and Medicare programs they can't access. So they're subsidizing programs they can't even use. Where this matters. This is a legitimate policy question about resource allocation, not a question of fact. You can believe that net fiscal burden is real and still think deportation is wrong because of humanitarian costs, or constitutional concerns, or practical impossibility. Or you can think the fiscal cost is worth it to avoid what you see as an unsustainable burden. But you should do it knowing the full picture, including that undocumented workers are a significant net contributors in some analyses. The 5th and 14th Amendment guarantee due process to all persons on U.S. soil, not just citizens. That means anyone facing deportation, including undocumented immigrants, has a constitutional right to a fair hearing, to see evidence against them, and to defend themselves. This is where enforcement becomes a real problem. Immigration courts have a backlog of 3.9 million cases and an average caseload of 5,286 cases per judge. Judges are completing around 700 cases per year when they need to complete roughly 2,600 to clear the backlog. And recently, mass firings of immigration judges, about 100 judges or 15% of the corps, have made this worse. So here's a constitutional tension. You can't have mass deportation and due process simultaneously. At current institutional capacity, judges are already being pressured to expedite cases, which means less time to review evidence, assess asylum claims, or prevent wrongful deportations. If you're truly committed to the rule of the law, you have to either A, massively fund immigration courts and hire judges, or B, accept that you're compromising due process. The Trump administration is using the Alien Enemies Act to justify mass deportations. Constitutional scholars are arguing this statute was never intended for peacetime, mass removal of civilians. Lower courts are already blocking attempts to use it this way. This will eventually reach the Supreme Court, and honestly, it's unclear how they will rule. At least 2 justices seem sympathetic to broad executive power, but it's not a slam dunk. Why this matters. If you believe in rule of law, you can't just ignore constitutional process because you want a policy outcome. That's how democracies slide. But you also might believe the Constitution allows mass removal and that due process can happen within expedited timelines. That's a different debate, but it's a constitutional debate, not a factual one. For the humanitarian cost. About 5.9 million U.S. citizen children have at least one undocumented parent. Mass deportation would separate millions of families, kids from their parents, spouses from each other, breadwinners from households. The documented psychological and economic effects are severe. Children separated from deported parents experience depression, PTSD, trauma, housing instability, food insecurity. Mixed status households where one parent gets deported see household income drop by nearly 50%, pushing families into poverty. This isn't abstract, these are real families, and the human cost of breaking them up is real. The counter argument, some people say that's exactly what should happen. These families shouldn't exist in the first place because the entry was legal. The parents made the choice to come illegally. The separation is a consequence of that choice, not something we're doing to them. It's harsh, but logically coherent. And personally, I think both positions are honest. You might say, yes, this will be painful for families, but the rule of law and national sovereignty matter more. Or you might say, the suffering created by separating established families far exceeds whatever benefit we get from deportation, especially given the economic data. But you're choosing based on your values, not because one side is objectively right. Now, for feasibility, which is usually the neglected question, here's something both sides should probably think about. Can you even do this? Operation Wetback in 1954 deported roughly 1 million people over several years. With massive federal resources and intense publicity, the undocumented population then was much smaller. Today, we're talking 11 to 14 million people. The Trump administration is reportedly on track to deport roughly 500,000 people this year, far below the stated goal of $1 million and 1 million people annually. And it's still not clear if that's sustainable. Current detention capacity is already strained at $14 billion annually. Expanding to deport millions would require building massive detention infrastructure, hiring thousands of new agents and immigration judges, and potentially military-style operations. This wouldn't be quick or cheap. The feasibility point matters because if deportation is genuinely infeasible at scale, then either A, you pursue targeted enforcement against recent arrivals or people with criminal records, which most people actually support, or B, you're fantasizing about a policy you can't implement. That's not a basis for law. Some people would say, so we just accept illegal immigration because enforcement is hard? And that's a fair pushback, but policy has to also deal with reality. If I'm honest, here are the actual forks in the road. First, how do you weigh rule of law versus pragmatism? One view says breaking the law has consequences, period. If you want to live here legally, follow the process. Another says, yes, but after someone has lived here 10 plus years, built a family, contributed to the economy, the proportional response is an exile. Both can believe in a rule of law while disagreeing on enforcement priorities. Second, is sovereignty more important than economic impact? You might believe a nation's right to control its borders, to decide who enters and stays, is fundamental, even if exercising that right costs the economy trillions. Or you might think economic harm at large requires overriding evidence of necessity, like a major security threat, which we don't have. This is a values call, not a facts call. Third, what are enforcement priorities? Almost everyone agrees you should deport people convicted of serious crimes. Most people support enforcement against recent arrivals. The disagreement is really about should we deport the people who've lived here for years, have families, work jobs, have no criminal records? The Trump administration says yes. Most economists and humanitarian groups say no. What matters is being explicit about whose interests get prioritized and why. Fourth, can we actually separate enforcement from collateral damage? Immigration enforcement inevitably sweeps up people who don't deserve it. Citizens wrongly detained, legal residents mistaken for undocumented, people with valid asylum claims. Can we build systems that minimize this, or is some collateral damage acceptable as the cost of enforcement? And here's my honest position. I don't think there's a purely factual answer to this of should we deport undocumented immigrants? The facts get you most of the way there. You can see that undocumented immigrants aren't uniquely dangerous, that the economic cost of mass deportation is enormous, that families will suffer, that the court system can't even handle it. But the final decision depends on what you think matters most: sovereignty and rule of law, or economic impact and humanitarian concerns. Is this a question where national borders are non-negotiable, or where results matter more than symbolic enforcement? You can look at the same data and come to different conclusions based on your values. What you shouldn't do is pretend the other side is stupid or acting in bad faith. The pro-enforcement side has legitimate concerns about rule of law and sovereignty. The anti-enforcement side has legitimate concerns about economic damage and humanitarian costs. The worst version of this debate is when people invent fake facts to support their position, claiming immigrants are crime waves, or that deportation costs nothing, or that it's all about racism, or that borders don't matter. The best version is when we acknowledge, here's what the evidence shows, here's where we actually disagree about priorities, and here's what we're choosing to value. And I think that's the conversation that it's worth having. Thank you for watching this video, and if you enjoyed this video, and only if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps so much. I hope you have a really good day.